The NFL draft is where you build the core of your roster. The roster that hopefully can become a champion. 2024 is no different when it comes to multiple teams that I just find so interesting for different reasons. The draft will feature many different teams at many different stages of competing, of rebuilding, of possibly retooling their roster to compete for that championship. And that's what this video is about. Identifying the most intriguing, interesting teams this NFL draft. This is my list of teams that I will have my eyes on. And not that all 32 NFL teams are not super interesting when it comes to the draft, but there are certainly about 10 to 12 every year that stand out for a multitude of reasons. And these are the teams that I personally find most captivating this 2024 NFL draft. Gronk, spike the like button. Get in the comments. Let me know what you guys think about my list. And if I left a team off that you find extremely fascinating this NFL draft. Also, if I mention your favorite team, let me know if you agree with my assessment. And let me know what you think your team is actually going to do in this draft. So let's kick it off with my first team, which is the Kansas City Chiefs, the Super Bowl champs. The Super Bowl champs are back-to-back champions. And I didn't mean to do that weird Spanish thing, but we're going to continue anyways. The Kansas City Chiefs are obviously trying to three-peat. And I believe that if they are going to three-peat, they will need an awesome draft. They will need a home run draft. And they will need a draft that replenishes multiple players and that brings game changers to their offense. That is why they're so fascinating. They traded L'Jarius Sneed, one of the best corners in football, if not the best corner in the NFL in 2023. And I talked about that trade in terms of how it negatively impacts the championship window of the Chiefs right now. Because he and that secondary is what made that Chiefs team in 2023, from my personal vantage point, the best team in football, or the Super Bowl champs, ultimately, because of their ability to cover in man-to-man coverage, their flexibility in the back end to play zone, to play man, to put pressure on their secondary, to be able to load the box and stop the run against teams like the Ravens or the Niners and kind of take away the disadvantage they may have up front. And Steve Spagnuolo, being one of the best defensive coordinators in football, kind of configured a defense that made it possible. But now that they've lost one of their big-time safeties with Mike Edwards, now that they've lost a corner in L'Jarius Sneed, their secondary certainly needs some replenishing. And then you look at the front seven, and I believe the linebacker position, obviously losing a key piece there, is probably going to need a little bit more depth. You look at the offensive line, the left tackle position, the wide receiver position with what's going on with Rashee Rice, which kind of continues in terms of this team has had kind of a weird offseason, right? They traded Sneed, but then off the field, you've got like Mahomes and the 12 ice cream sandwiches a night thing. You've got, of course, Travis Kelce and what's going on with his brother and what's going on with his girlfriend. That's constantly in the news. You've got to talk about, okay, Rashee Rice. They obviously made big news in terms of signing Marquise Brown, but it feels like with Rashee Rice potentially not being in the picture this year, maybe, I don't know, they're going to have to replenish wide receiver. there's just a lot going on with the Chiefs, and they haven't really figured out left tackle. Kelsey's only getting older. Like, this is a team that if they want to continue to be that top dog in the AFC, especially with a team like Houston on the rise and all these teams trying to beat them and try to target them, they're going to have to nail another draft. And you kind of wonder, like, this has been a team that has been really good in the draft, especially in 2022. And it feels like, can they nail another draft? Because that could make them continue to captivate the NFL year after year after year and continue to win and continue to extend this dynasty. So they have their typical picks. They don't pick till 32 in the first round. But you look at all the needs that they could possibly have. You might see them go offensive line in the first round. You might see them go receiver in the first round, if not in the second round. You might see them try to help out that secondary where they lost some pieces. Although I do feel like they have enough there to get by. It's just going to be like, where do they pick and choose to get stronger? Is it areas where they were weaker last year? Or was it areas where they were stronger, where they maybe lost pieces like their secondary? Or maybe they try to strengthen a unit like their pass rush to compensate for that. So much could go on here with the Super Bowl champs. I'm just really interested to see where they pick their spots, if they trade up, if they trade down. What do they do here to try to continue to build this roster around number 15, Patrick Mahomes? So the first team is the Chiefs. I find them really interesting almost every year. Next up, we've got the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals are really interesting to me because they're one of the teams that is definitely in the conversation of aiming for the Chiefs. They've done it before. They've knocked them off, and they're one of the few teams to be able to do so. And so you have to give them that credit and that responsibility of being one of the teams that could potentially do it. You look at their draft, and they have multiple third-round picks. They do pick relatively early for their standards in the first round since Joe Burrow got there at 18th overall. They have 17th pick in the second round. They have multiple 6th round picks, multiple 7th round picks. So they've got enough pieces here to potentially move up in the draft, potentially pick some really nice players later in the draft, maybe get a diamond in the rough. But this is a Bengals roster that is pretty complete. They don't have too many holes. And I think another reason they're super interesting is the kind of lurking question of, is T. Higgins going to get traded, right? That's one of those players that could get traded on draft day. So does he get traded for a first round pick or a second round pick, and then they end up trying to replace him in the draft in the first round or something like that? If they pick somebody at 18 wide receiver, you might know that T. Higgins is getting traded, right? Maybe a little bit later. So something there could happen with the Bengals. You could also maybe take a look at them picking a defensive lineman to help replace the big loss of DJ Reader, both figuratively and literally. Also, Sheldon Rankin signed, I get it, but still, they could use a big defensive lineman to help that run defense. Secondary could certainly be a spot, especially the corner position, where they continue to add pieces. They do like to do that. And then, I mean, they don't have a lot of pieces like running back. Do they go there the first year without Joe Mixon in a long time? There's offensive line always for them. That seems to be a question, but I feel like they've done a good job of helping with Trent Brown, but maybe they look for a long-term solution at the tackle position. So there's multiple things they could do, but they have a lot of picks for not a lot of needs, which makes it really interesting to see if they maybe make a bold move and try to go for a big-time prospect, or, does T. Higgins get traded? How does that change their plans? They could dictate a lot of this flow of the draft depending on what they want to do this year. So the Bengals are really, really interesting and could really bolster a good Bengal roster. Next up, the Buffalo Bills. The Bills are fascinating to me because obviously they just traded Stephon Diggs, and that just kind of changes the picture for me of what's going to happen in this draft, because I kind of felt like after they signed Curtis Samuel and they had Stephon Diggs on the roster, I figured that there was always in the back of my mind, kind of in there somewhere, that Diggs might get traded. But at the same time, I felt like, well, if they keep Diggs, which it felt like they might because of the contract, and it felt serviceable to kind of keep him at least one more year. But now that they've traded him, it changes that idea of, well, now they don't have to pick a receiver in the first round. Now they kind of definitely do, right? Like, that's what it feels like to me. They definitely have to pick a receiver in the first round at 28, or maybe they trade up and they try to make a bold move for a big-time wide receiver prospect. This is a deep class of receivers, though, so maybe they even pass on receiver in the first round, and maybe they go with offensive line, or maybe they go with defensive line, and then the second round, maybe they go for a receiver, or maybe, they're kind of trying to build this roster around Josh Allen in a unique and fresh way. And my question is, like, how much do they value receiver? How much they value offensive line? How much they value defensive line? All these different things where maybe they're going to look at what the Chiefs did a couple years ago and say, like, well, the Chiefs didn't immediately just go to replace Tyreek Hill right away. They actually took a different approach. They went with defense, right? And McDermott is a defensive coach. So do you kind of lean into McDermott, or maybe do you lean into, like, let's build a really good offensive line? Let's run the ball with James Cook. Let's have multiple tight ends. That could be another way that they go. So there's a lot of different things that the Bills could do here to make this team different. And that's what fascinates me. Make them more, diverse, or make them more balanced, or make them just a different era of Bill football that was not the same as the previous team. So that's what intrigues me the most. But you look at their picks, and they have, obviously, their first and their second round pick. They don't have their third, but they have 2 fourths, 3 fifths, 2 sixths, and a 7th. So they have a lot of picks late, especially 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, right? They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 picks in the final day of the draft. So do they use some of those picks, maybe multiple fourths, and try to trade up in the second or try to trade up in the first? So we'll see what happens, but the Bills could definitely use a really, really solid draft. I feel like this is a big-time turning point for the Bills franchise. Next, we've got the Minnesota Vikings. I think the Minnesota Vikings are really interesting for obvious reasons. This is one of the teams that's probably most obvious, but they had 2 first-round picks. So that makes them extremely interesting. On top of that, we've heard the rumors about them potentially picking a quarterback. I mean, how long have we heard that? Right? Is it going to be a trade up for Drake May, or for McCarthy, or Jaden Daniels, or maybe they'll go with a Michael Penix a little bit later, or what are they going to do, right? Because Sam Darnold is not the long-term solution, maybe a bridge quarterback, but not the long-term solution. And then you've got to think about, okay, the offense looks pretty good on paper, so they're not probably going to be looking at offense very much. How can we continue to stock up the shelves on defense and make this Brian Flores defense that much better, which I felt like really got a lot better during free agency? So it's about thinking about how can we use, the money that we used in free agency to help other areas of our roster outside of the quarterback position and build a team around a young quarterback in the future, whether that be in this draft, whether that be in the next draft, whether that be if we trade up or we kind of stay back and see what happens. But they could very well pick a quarterback at 11. I wouldn't be shocked by that. Maybe they go with J.J. McCarthy at 11, or maybe they go with, a Michael Penix in the second, or, trade back and stock up more picks with that first round pick, the 23rd pick. Maybe they trade back to the second, or maybe they pick Penix at 23, or maybe they pick Bo Nix later. I don't know, but they could do a lot of different things. So that's what's coming to my mind. But I really think that offense is pretty well situated. Like, yeah, Aaron Jones is short term, but that's the running back. Okay, whatever. The tight end is there and signed. Jefferson is going to be signed, right? And big money. Jordan Addison is there for a while. So you've got the core pieces, and the offensive line, you've got 2 bookend tackles that are in their prime. You've got guards that are I think they could use 1 guard. But the defense, right? Like, you've got your edge rushers now with Van Ginkel and with Greenard, but I feel like the defensive line could use some work. The secondary could use some work. But that's the areas I think they're going to fill out with maybe one of their first round picks, or maybe, their later picks, and maybe they try to trade up for a quarterback early, because this roster feels pretty good on the surface. If they trade up, they won't be destroyed by losing all their draft capital, because the roster feels like if they had a good quarterback, they'd be a borderline playoff team, or a playoff team in general with the coaching they have, definitely. So yeah, the Vikings are intriguing because they could do a lot of different things with the capital they have in the first round. And no matter what they do, they're going to be fascinating for those reasons. Next up, the Los Angeles Rams. The Los Angeles Rams are interesting to me just because they finally have draft picks. Like, I don't really know what a Sean McVay draft looks like. Like, I don't remember the last time he had a first-round pick, if ever. So, he has a first-round pick with the 19th pick in the NFL draft. We will see what the Rams will take. They have a second. They have 2 thirds. They have multiple fifths. They have 4 sixth-round picks and a 7th. So they have a ton of draft capital. And they also have a little bit of a transition going on. Last year was sort of their transitional era season, but they managed to be very competitive due to a couple breakout players on offense, running back and wide receiver in Nakua and Williams. McVay being a great coach, right? Still having Raheem Morris to work that defense and kind of groom some younger players. And then Aaron Donald was still there. But now Aaron Donald's gone. So how do we kind of shift our defensive perspective, shift our defensive identity? How do we replenish that? Because it's going to be really hard to replace Aaron Donald. What do we do to help our defense post Aaron Donald? What do we do to make our offense, which is arguably one of the best in football right now, even stronger? How do we continue to supplement Stafford for this run that we want to go on in the next 2 to 3 years? Because that's the window we have left with Matthew Stafford. So, you know, this is a team that has a draft for the first time in a long time, and I'm just intrigued by that almost alone. Next up, the Chicago Bears. So obviously the Chicago Bears have the first overall pick in the 2024 NFL draft, and they don't have many picks after that. They only have 4 picks. 4 in this draft. First pick, 9th pick, 3rd rounder, and a 4th rounder. But that being said, that's all they need. You look at their roster, and it's pretty well complete outside of defensive line and quarterback, and maybe depth receiver. So other than that, I kind of look at their draft, and I feel like I almost left them off the list because I almost feel like it's going to be really obvious. Like, they're going to pick Caleb Williams first. Everybody knows that. But then what do they do with the other picks to help Caleb? And how do they decide to use that capital? Will they trade back in that 9th position and pick up more capital because they only have so many picks? Like, after they pick Caleb, they'll have 3 picks left. So will they trade back that 9th pick? That'd probably be a good idea. Get a bunch of other picks, kind of continue to get some young talent into this building on this roster? Or do they just try to say, hey, our roster's pretty good right now. Like, we like what we've done in free agency. We like the Keenan Allen trade for the receiver. We don't have to deal with that. The offensive line is pretty well settled. We used a first-round pick last year on a tackle. The defense is pretty solid. Montez Sweat, we used to pick on him. Obviously, you know, we like Jalen Johnson being back. We've got our linebackers. Yeah, we could use a defensive lineman, but maybe we just pick one at 9. I don't think the idea of picking a receiver at 9 is a good idea, personally. I think they should pick the best defensive prospect they can, or trade back and pick somebody. I also feel like the later picks will probably just go to like offensive line, defensive line. That's kind of what I feel. But the Chicago Bears are intriguing because they hold that first pick. It's going to be a big show for Caleb Williams. And then from there on out, what do they determine is the best action? Because they want to fulfill the best team possible in the early window of Caleb Williams' career. So that's what makes them so fascinating. Next up, the Denver Broncos. The Broncos are a big deal in this draft, low key, because they moved on from Russell Wilson. So it puts a lot of pressure on Sean Payton and this team, although, right, the fan base kind of expects them to suck this year. There's pressure because Sean Payton was brought in to be the savior of Russell Wilson or the franchise or both, right? And that did not happen in year 1. They were better. They were more competitive. They were at least more watchable, but it did not go as planned. And now they've got to pivot and they've got to open their eyes to a bit of a rebuild with a coach that was retired previously. So it's a weird spot. But it's also extremely interesting because do the Broncos get urgent? The fan base is kind of urgent. The fan base is kind of angry because they thought they were going to be a winning team for at least 3 to 5 years with Russell Wilson, and they didn't end up being that. And now is Sean Payton urgent? Because he came back to football probably expecting to win pretty quickly, and they kind of spent money in his first free agency. So do they use that 12th pick on a quarterback? Do they try to trade up aggressively and get a quarterback like a Drake May or like a Jaden Daniels early, or JJ McCarthy even at like 5th or 6th pick? Do they trade back that 12th pick and kind of replenish the roster with the picks they could get for the 12th overall selection? Maybe McCarthy's still hanging there. Maybe they trade back and somebody picks McCarthy up or another quarterback or whatever, and then they pick up a second rounder, which they don't have, right? They do have a 3rd, a 4th, 3 5ths, and 2 6ths. So they don't have like a lack of capital, but it's more so could they just continue to add picks to a roster that, in my opinion, is not very good and a far ways away, right? They could use receivers. Their offensive line is aging in certain positions. The defense could certainly use a lot of help at pass rusher, defensive line, even corner outside of Surtain, and safety. So like this Denver roster is bad. The quarterback position is bad. But what did they determine to fulfill first? The quarterback or the roster? And that kind of gives the question that makes them so interesting. Next, the Washington Commanders. Obviously, they hold the 2nd pick in the NFL draft. They are going to select a quarterback. Many people believe it's going to be Jaden Daniels, but then there's some that believe it's going to be Drake May. So just there, especially as somebody that their favorite team ends up picking, right after Washington, I'm pretty invested in what the Commanders are going to end up doing. Do they pick Drake May? Do they pick Jaden Daniels? It's obviously going to be a quarterback, but which one are they going to choose? I would much rather them pick Jaden Daniels as a Patriots fan because I want Drake May, as you guys know, to fall to my team. So that being said, I am invested. I am on the edge of my seat. I am captivated. I am fascinated by this team and seeing what they do at number 2. There is a very small chance they trade this pick. So that's also a possibility. But they have, an opportunity here with a new ownership group, with multiple people kind of invested in this general manager sort of front office situation, having a say in their decision making. Dan Quinn as the fresh new head coach, having a new coaching staff involving a former head coach himself and Cliff Kingsbury. There's a lot of people that will have some say here in what they do in terms of Daniels or May, and then also in terms of what do they do with the rest of their draft. How does this new era look in Washington with the Commanders? Are they going to fulfill some faith in this fan base? Which to me in free agency wasn't fully fulfilled. They made some nice moves. Some of it, was trying to get back to even, trying to get back to normal, trying to get back to, just a baseline because it felt like they were so lacking talent in certain situations. But they have 2 seconds. They have 3 thirds. So there's a big chance on day 2, especially after they pick that quarterback at number 2, to get some young talent. Right? Get offensive linemen, get a corner if they so choose, get defensive line and pass rush for Dan Quinn, get whatever, tight end, I don't know. But they could go multiple different ways here in trying to support that young quarterback and trying to rebuild this roster. And it feels like they have enough draft capital to make that happen relatively quickly if they can nail some of these picks. So really interesting first draft for this new group in Washington. Next, the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals obviously hold multiple picks in the first round. They have the 4th pick and the 27th selection in the first round, which I think a lot of people are kind of forgetting about the Cardinals because they don't need a quarterback, right? Everybody assumes they'll keep Kyler Murray, which I think you're 100% correct to assume that. So that being said, they're not going to go quarterback, which makes them less interesting than a team like New England or the Commanders or whatever, right? Like for a lot of people. But still, this is a team that last year had a new head coach, a whole new regime, all that stuff. I think that they solidified sort of a rebuild, kind of got rid of the guys they needed to get rid of, and now they're sort of retooling in the way that the Texans did, where they're slowly but surely trying to find veteran free agents that can come in and fulfill roles and then try to nail those draft picks where they can. So what are they going to do at number 4? Are they going to trade back to a quarterback-hungry team? Maybe, right? Will they try to get more picks and try to continue to replenish the defense that could use a lot of help, or the offensive skill positions? Are they going to pick someone at 4, like a game-changing receiver to help Kyler Murray? How much say does Kyler kind of have in this situation? There's a lot of things that could happen here. Like, I feel like their offensive line is in decent shape, so I don't think they really need to go there. But receiver is certainly a huge need. I think that the defense needs a lot of stuff. And they've got a lot of picks to make this thing happen, right? They've got the 4th pick. They've got 27th. They've got a 2nd. They've got multiple 3rds, 3. They've got multiple 5ths. So they've got a bunch of draft capital. So they can manipulate the board, trade up in certain situations for a player that they really like, trade down if they so choose at 27 back to the 2nd round, maybe pick up more picks for day 2. They can, trade back from number 4. But there's a lot of different things they could do. Honestly, I think at 4, you probably should just pick a player. If the 3 top quarterbacks are off the board, it doesn't make sense for another team to trade up to 4, just in my opinion. So I think that they'll probably pick someone at 4, like Marvin Harrison. And then I think at 27, it would make more sense to trade back because there's probably somebody there that's worth moving up for, and then getting some extra picks for day 2, and then maybe just continue to go defense. That's just my opinion, but it is Gannon. We'll see what happens. The Cardinals, fascinating, and I think kind of slept on. Next, the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers are fascinating for obvious reasons. They have Jim Harbaugh. And anything involving Jim Harbaugh is always edge-of-your-seat television. He is a character, and he is an enigma, which makes it super interesting to find out what he values for his NFL team, because he's going to have a lot to say. Do you want to go with offensive line to build the line of scrimmage? Do you want to go with defensive line to build a pass rush, a line of scrimmage once again? Do you want to get a big-time playmaker for Justin Herbert at receiver, although you do feel like you should be a power running team with Justin Herbert as your quarterback? I don't know if I agree with that. Do you go, with secondary? I don't know. Like, the Chargers have more needs than people would think. But they do have a franchise quarterback. They do have a franchise left tackle. They got rid of multiple great receivers. So does that make it more available for them to pick a receiver early in this draft? Plus, the kind of wild card factor to this is that Jim Harbaugh has been scouting these players, has been recruiting these players, has coached some of these players in this draft. So it's kind of like that Pete Carroll sort of situation where does he have an insider hand, right, at drafting some of these players? And that also makes this draft super interesting for the Chargers. They could very well nail it. They could very well hit big. But at the very end of the day, no matter what they do, Harbaugh will be captivating to watch. Next, the San Francisco 49ers. My second last team on this list. The 49ers, obviously, I'm a little biased because I like the Niners. I like to see them win. And it feels like they're overdue for a Super Bowl. But that's what makes them so interesting. How do they get there again? How do they win it? And they actually have a lot of picks this year. They're finally kind of out of that Trey Lance window of trading all their firsts and all that stuff, right? They have their first, they have their second, they have their third, and then they also have a lot of comp picks. So they have 3/4, they have multiple sixths. So they've got picks. And this makes the Niners have the ability, and as well as having a roster that's pretty well stacked, they don't need a lot of things outside of possible offensive line reinforcements, maybe some secondary reinforcements. But outside of that, this is a team that's loaded with A-plus talent and blue-chip players. So where did they decide to go, and how did they decide to do it? Did they trade up and be aggressive? Do they trade back and try to get younger at certain positions? Do they look to really solidify the protection of Purdy? Do they trade Brandon Ayuk? That's another wild card question that could come. Do they try to maybe look at a position like safety and try to get younger there? Or do they try to add more pass rush depth? Like, there's so many different things they could do. And the Niners are super interesting for reasons like the Chiefs and the Bengals. They're like trying to win, and they're trying to do it in a manner where it's got to be quick. Like, it's got to be timely. It's now. But it's also like, how do we do that? Like, how do we get over the top? Like, how do we continue to push? How do we get back to the Super Bowl? How do we win the Super Bowl? Is it by kind of continuing to strengthen our strengths? Is it trying to solidify our weaknesses? And the Niners now have kind of those picks to be able to do that. And I personally think offensive line will be the focus, but we'll find out on draft day. And the final team is the New England Patriots. You really thought you were going to come into this video without the New England Patriots being named? But the New England Patriots should be interesting to pretty much everybody because they have the third pick in the NFL draft. And with that third pick, they can potentially pick a quarterback, but they haven't exactly given away their hand. And that makes them interesting because two quarterbacks are certainly going to go ahead of them. So do they pick a receiver? Do they trade back and get a haul of picks for the future? Do they then have multiple first-round picks in the first round of this year's draft, which makes it like, okay, do they go tackle? Do they go receiver? Do they try to pick a quarterback still? There's so many different things that could happen with the Patriots draft, which I don't recall in a very long time of having this sort of excitement for the draft. I kind of always laughed at people about this. Like, I was always a free agency guy, and I think that was because my team was always in a championship window, which made veteran additions way more interesting to me than young additions, right? Because I wasn't focused on the future. I was focused on how can we get Brady ring 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, right? And usually it was by trading for Randy Moss or by signing Stephon Gilmore. You understand? So for Patriots fans, this is a shift in perspective, especially probably Patriots fans of my age, in their 20s, because we've experienced mostly the winning side. The younger people maybe are kind of familiar with the winning, but also sort of like been in this new era where they trying to want to get back to the glory days of what they thought when they were younger. And then the older guys are like, well, we've been here before and we kind of know what this is like. So we're rebuilding and we'll be patient about it. And we've already seen enough winning. So like, yeah. And I'm kind of like in the middle where I want to see a quarterback because quarterback's so important. And I want to, if it's Drake May, I obviously have bias, but I think the guy's phenomenal, so I want him. But at the same time, I wouldn't be opposed to trading back because I know how much value that could bring the team. But at the same time, do I trust this new general manager? Do I trust this new front office to really pick the best players? I don't know. I don't know the track record, right? Like, this is kind of a new regime in terms of a different way of drafting, a different way of picking players. It's more of a Packer style, not a Patriot style. I don't know what type of players they're going to go after because it's a new offense. It's going to be same sort of defensive scheme, but new offense. So I don't really have that 20 plus years of knowledge as a fan to understand what type of prospect they're going to like. So that's another thing. But there's just so many things here with the Patriots. They might be the most interesting team in the draft, and that is weird to say about the Patriots. Like, it really is. But at number 3, they can do so many different things. Quarterback, trade back, pick a receiver. They could do all those things. At the same time, they could be rather boring, where they just pick Drake May, and then they pick Jaden Daniels, and then they pick, like, tackle, and then they pick receiver, and it's very obvious. Or they could be super exciting, where it's like they traded back. They picked a receiver. Then they picked another receiver. And then they picked a tackle in the second and all this stuff. And they have a pick next year. And they have 2 firsts next year. Or they could like pick Drake May and then the trade up in the first again. And then pick a receiver. So there's so much they could do here where It's fascinating from so many different levels and perspectives and ways. So yeah, these are the teams that I think are most interesting in this year's draft, and these are the teams I can't wait to see what they do. Let me know yours in the comment section below. It's Mitch. Thank you for listening to me ranting about the NFL. Subscribe. Peace.